You wait out there where the drivers sit. 5 minutes. Don't embarrass me in front of the board. I'm already in the lobby. I'll be right there. Who is he?
Probably her driver.
I think she'll sign it for us quickly. Mr. Harlan! Mr. Harlan! Is Quentin Harlan here? Miss Cole cannot move forward without his technical signature.
Everyone's looking for you, Mr. Harlan.
I've known about your legacy signature rights for 8 months, Mr. Harlan. I just needed a reasonable excuse to get you here, in public. Your wife turned out to be the perfect one.
Quentin Harlan was 45 years old, and for 20 years he had lived by one simple rule. If you do the work quietly and do it well, the truth eventually stands up for you, even when you never say a word in your own defense. That rule was about to be tested in a hotel lobby on Michigan Avenue on a cold, rainy Tuesday night in March by the one person who was supposed to already know his worth. His wife asked him to wait outside. Not in a side room, not near the bar, on a wooden bench by the service entrance in the rain, the way you'd ask a driver to wait out his shift. What she didn't know was that the woman running the entire event that night had been quietly searching for Quentin Harlan for 8 months because without his signature, a $400 million deal could not move 1 inch further. Before we get into the story, if you believe the quiet ones are usually the strongest ones in the room, stay with me tonight. Because a man who'd spent 11 years being introduced as just the city worker was about to become the one person in that hotel nobody could do without. Now let's go back to how the evening actually began. The rain over North Michigan Avenue that night was thin and cold. The kind that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into your collar before you notice it's there. Outside the Four Seasons Hotel at 900 North Michigan Avenue, valets in long coats moved between headlights and through the tall glass doors. Golden light spilled onto the wet sidewalk like something poured from a pitcher. Inside, camera flashes popped in polite little bursts. Investors in tailored coats laughed the practiced laugh of people who already believe they've won something. It was the kind of room built to make ordinary people feel smaller. And it worked mostly on the people who let it. A black car pulled to the curb at exactly 6:52 p.m. Zawadi Harlan stepped out first, the hem of her wine-red dress catching just enough light to look poured rather than worn. Her hair had been flat-ironed to a glassy shine, pulled back tight and elegant. Her Chanel bag held just so. She thanked the driver with a smile she'd practiced longer than she'd ever practiced her wedding vows. Then Quentin stepped out behind her. There was still a faint, chalky streak of drywall dust on the shoulder of his navy work jacket, left over from the afternoon shift. His jeans were heavy-duty. His work boots were broken in and honest. On his left wrist sat a scratched Casio watch, the kind you don't wear because it's fashionable, but because your mother handed it to you the day you got your first job with the Department of Public Works, and a man doesn't retire things like that. He stood 6'2", built broad and solid from 20 years of real labor rather than a gym membership. And there was a stillness in him, the kind that never asks to be noticed, and usually isn't until the moment it matters most. Zawadi's eyes swept the lobby the way they always did now, cataloging who was watching. 2 investors near the champagne table glanced their way. That was enough. She took Quentin's arm not gently but efficiently and steered him toward a shadowed alcove near the service doors. "You sit out here," she said, her voice low, final, already halfway back to the light. "Where the drivers wait. 5 minutes. I just need a few photos with the board and then I'll come get you." Quentin didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He reached over and straightened the collar of her blazer so it would sit right for the cameras. One more small, unnoticed thing, the kind he'd done 100 times over 11 years of marriage. And then he turned and walked toward the bench. He lowered himself onto the hard wooden seat by the service entrance, the one usually kept for drivers and staff waiting out their employers' evenings. He set his hands on his knees, broad, calloused hands that had rerouted half the water lines beneath the south side, and watched the rain slide down the glass. If you've ever sat quiet through a slight so small that nobody else in the room even noticed it happen, you already know exactly what that bench felt like. And for one long moment, Quentin wasn't in a hotel lobby at all. He was 8 years back, standing outside a different restaurant in a different rain, hearing an almost identical sentence. "You sit out here? It looks more professional on their 3rd wedding anniversary." He remembered waiting 2 hours that night. He was never let inside. He never mentioned it again. Not once in the 11 years since. Some men carry things quietly because they learned a long time ago that carrying them loudly never once made the load lighter. In his jacket pocket from 15 years of habit sat an old brass key to substation number 7 in Bronzeville. The same key his grandfather had once carried, back when he'd helped wire that very substation by hand. A place most people filling that lobby had never heard of and never would. Near the check-in desk hung a faded black and white photograph, Bronzeville 1978, a row of residents standing proud in front of a senior housing block that still stood today. For now. On the registration table lay an open folder, a short list of names circled in red ink. People who, for reasons no one in that lobby understood yet, had to be present in that building before anything could be signed. Zawadi walked deeper into the light without once turning back to look at him. A young hotel employee glanced at Quentin on the bench, leaned toward a coworker and murmured, "Probably her driver." Quentin's phone buzzed once against his hip. A text from his mother, Amma. "Bring your warm coat, baby. I'm waiting to hear from you." He had no idea that before the night was over, every single person in that lobby would know exactly who he was. He just sat there in the rain, hands folded, waiting out his 5 minutes. Which, as they always seemed to, were about to stretch into something no one in that room was prepared for. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, someone is going to walk straight past the CEO, straight past the investors, and call out a name nobody expected to matter tonight. His. Zawadi was laughing with a cluster of investors near the champagne table, her head tilted just so, when a young woman in a gray dress came half running out from the service hallway, heels clicking sharp against marble. It was Mariana, the CEO's secretary, and her voice carried further than she probably meant it to. "Is Quentin Harlan here? Ms. Cole cannot move forward with the signing without his technical signature." The lobby went quiet, the way a room does right before something changes. Every head turned not toward the stage, not toward the champagne table, but toward the man sitting on the wooden bench by the service entrance. Whispers rose fast the way they do in rooms full of people who make a living reading which way the wind just shifted. Zawadi's smile froze halfway to her ears. For a moment she considered pretending she hadn't heard. She had spent 11 years learning how to arrange a room so that Quentin's presence never had to be explained. But there was no arranging this. Every head in that lobby had already turned toward the bench by the service doors, and there was nothing left to do but watch. Then Ashanti Cole herself stepped down off the small stage of, tall, gray-haired, dressed in a suit so plain it looked expensive precisely because it refused to try, and walked directly toward Quentin. She extended her hand to him in front of the entire room of investors and reporters, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but not quiet enough. "I've known about your legacy signature rights for 8 months, Mr. Harlan," she said. "I only needed a reasonable excuse to get you here in public. Your wife turned out to be the perfect one. It wasn't a title the city had given him, and it wasn't one Cascade could simply buy its way around. Back in 1961, Quentin's grandfather had been the certifying engineer who designed and installed the original substation network beneath Bronzeville work. The city itself hadn't trusted to any outside contractor at the time. In exchange, the family had negotiated one unusual clause into the original easement. No future modification to that specific grid could proceed without the sign-off of the certifying engineer of record or their direct legal heir. Quentin had inherited that clause, the way other men inherit a watch or a house. He'd had it formally reaffirmed through his own city certification the year he took the job, mostly out of respect for his grandfather, never once expecting it would matter to anyone outside a filing cabinet. Until tonight. Zawadi stood frozen near the champagne table. Heat climbed up her neck and into her face. Ashanti Cole was 53 years old and had built her career on never once raising her voice in a room where raising it would cost her something. She simply nodded once toward the elevator, and the room parted for her the way water parts for a boat that already knows where it's going. Mariana followed half a step behind, eyes down clipboard against her chest, saying nothing. She had been told to find one man in a work jacket. She had done her job. Ashanti invited Quentin up to a private conference room on the 3rd floor. Zawadi was permitted to come along, though nobody had quite invited her. The room was quiet, carpeted, lit the soft gold of money that doesn't need to explain itself. A thick folder sat waiting on the table. Bronzeville Legacy Corridor. Quentin sat down and opened it, turning the pages slowly with fingers still marked from years of manual labor. The paper smelled faintly of new toner, crisp and cold. Nothing at all like the worn blueprints he was used to handling in the basement of the Public Works building. He read the way he'd always read important things, slowly twice, before he let his face show anything at all. On page 17 in the technical appendix, he found a form titled Spousal Acknowledgement of Project Awareness, bearing his own electronic signature, filed 3 weeks earlier. He stared at it a long moment before he understood. The signature had been lifted from a refinancing document Zawadi had handed him to sign in a hurry one night, right after he'd come off a double shift, his eyes still red from a sleepless night fixing an emergency outage. He'd signed it standing in the kitchen, half asleep, trusting his wife the way a man trusts 11 years of marriage. What Cascade's lawyers had done with that signature, lifting it from one document and attaching it to another without his knowledge, was its own kind of wrong, serious enough that Timothy would later tell him it qualified as grounds for a fraud complaint all on its own. Quentin never filed one. He had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose the advantage of being right was to spend it arguing in a courtroom instead of using it in a room like this one. He kept turning pages. His face went still in a way that was worse than anger. Appendix C laid it out plainly. The project would permanently close 2 side streets and relocate the entire senior housing block at Building 47 on South Parkway. The street generations of Bronzeville families still called by its old name, even now that the signs read differently. The public materials described it as residents relocating voluntarily. The internal notes described something else entirely. Controlled utility interruptions timed to encourage that voluntary decision along. Attached at the back, Quentin recognized the same list he'd glimpsed downstairs on the registration table an hour earlier. Names circled in red ink. It wasn't a guest list at all. It was the legally required notice roster every resident Cascade was obligated to formally acknowledge before the easement clause his grandfather had written could even be triggered. Whoever had prepared that folder downstairs had known exactly whose lives were on that page. They just hadn't expected the man sitting on the bench outside to be the one holding the pen. Quentin's mother, Amma, had lived in that building for 12 years. So had families who'd called that block home for 3 generations, people who remembered when the streetlights on that corner still ran on the old grid he himself had helped modernize 15 years ago. Back when he was young enough to think that kind of work would always be seen for what it was. He thought about the framed photograph downstairs in the lobby, the one from 1978. He thought about how easy it was for a room full of well-dressed people to describe a neighborhood as underutilized, when none of them had ever had to carry their mother's groceries up 3 flights because the elevator had been temporarily out of service for 4 months running. He set the folder down and looked first at Ashanti, then turned slowly to his wife. "Did you know my mother lived there?" Zawadi said nothing. She hadn't known. She had never once asked. Quentin reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He opened an old email, one he had never shown her, and turned the screen so both women could read it. 3 years earlier, a private infrastructure firm had offered him a regional director position at 3 times his city salary. He had turned it down with a single line, the only line he'd ever needed. If I leave this seat, nobody will be left to remember that the water lines and the original cable runs of Bronzeville still pass right under the feet of the old folks who've lived there their whole lives. Zawadi read it twice. For 11 years, she had believed her husband simply lacked ambition, a man content with a city paycheck and a scratched-up watch. She was only now understanding that he had turned down an entire different future on purpose, to protect a neighborhood she had never bothered to ask him about. Something in her chest went very quiet, the way a house goes quiet right before a storm finally breaks over it. She had told herself for years that she was the one carrying the marriage forward, reaching for something better for both of them. She was only now beginning to wonder if she'd had that backwards the entire time. If you've ever discovered years into loving someone that you never really asked them the one question that would have told you who they truly were, you already know exactly how that room felt in that moment. Ashanti finally broke the silence, tapping the folder closed with one finger. The signing ceremony is in 20 minutes downstairs, Mr. Harlan. The board is expecting your wife's remarks and your signature immediately after. Quentin didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the black and white photograph in his mind. The one from the lobby 1978, a whole neighborhood standing proud in front of a building that was as far as anyone downstairs knew about, to disappear on paper tonight. He closed the folder, himself stood and said only, "We'll see." Zawadi followed him out of the room, half a step behind, her heels suddenly much louder in the hallway than they had been all evening. Down in the grand hall, the podium lights were already being tested, throwing long white beams across empty rows of chairs that would be full within minutes. Somewhere behind that podium sat a printed page with her name on it, words she had written herself weeks ago, in a tone she'd been proud of at the time, before she'd ever imagined her own husband would be the one standing in that room to hear them read aloud. A production assistant clipped a lavalier microphone to her blazer with brisk, practiced hands, completely unaware that the woman standing in front of her was no longer thinking about her speech at all. She had no way of knowing yet that in 20 minutes, everything she'd built her whole image around was about to collapse in front of every camera in that hall, and that the man she'd asked to wait outside like a stranger was the only person in the building who actually had the power to stop it. Quentin now knows the truth about that speech, and about what it does to his mother's home. Zawadi still doesn't know that he knows. If you were backstage in his place, do you stop her before she reads it, or let her walk up and read every word live? Team stop her or team let her read? Drop your answer below. The grand hall filled fast. Cameras on tripods lined the back wall, red recording lights blinking steady. Reporters found their seats. Investors settled into the front rows with the particular ease of people who have never once worried about where they're allowed to sit. Ashanti Cole took the podium first. She thanked the mayor's office for its partnership, thanked the board for its patience through 8 months of negotiations, and spoke for exactly 90 seconds about what she called a new chapter for a historic neighborhood. She had given this kind of speech at a dozen ribbon cuttings before. Her voice never once wavered because it never had to. Then, with a small gesture of her hand, she invited Zawadi Harlan up to deliver the community remarks. Remarks Zawadi herself had written weeks earlier, back when the project had still felt like a door opening, rather than one about to close on her. Zawadi climbed the 3 steps to the stage in her heels, holding a single printed page. The paper described the senior housing block on South Parkway as an underutilized space with untapped redevelopment potential. She had written that sentence herself at her desk 3 weeks ago, feeling clever about it. She stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the room. Somewhere in the back rows, a woman she recognized from a magazine gala nodded encouragingly, the way people do when they assume the moment ahead of you is going to go exactly the way you planned it. Zawadi had spent 11 years learning how to read a room like this one. Who to smile at, who to thank by name, who to let catch her eye just long enough to feel important. She had never once, in all that practice, learned what to do in a room that already knew the truth before she opened her mouth. Quentin sat in the side section, in a folding chair near the aisle. still in his work jacket, hands folded in his lap. He did not look up at her. He had learned a long time ago that the moment right before something breaks is usually quieter than the moment after. Near the entrance of the hall, just outside the doors, stood Amma Harlan Quentin's mother. 67 years old in her good cardigan, holding her purse with both hands the way she'd held it in church every Sunday for 40 years. Her name had appeared on the official list of affected residents. No one had thought to send her an invitation inside, though a security guard had been kind enough to let her stand close enough to hear, through the propped-open door. She had lived on South Parkway long enough to remember when the block still had its old name on the street signs, and long enough to know that a room like this one rarely built anything for people like her without being asked to first. Zawadi looked down at the page in her hands. She looked out at the room again. Her hand holding the paper had started very slightly to shake. If you've ever stood in front of a room and realized, right in that instant, that the words in your hand were no longer words you were willing to say out loud, you already know exactly what came next. She set the page down on the podium, next to the microphone, and did not pick it back up. "I can't read this," Zawadi said. Her voice cracked on the second word, then steadied. "Part of what's presented here about the senior housing block, Building 47, was incomplete. Misleading. I wrote it. I'm responsible for it." The hall went perfectly silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on a room instead of simply filling it. Camera flashes kept firing, rapid and relentless, capturing a woman's face come slowly apart in real time. Ashanti Cole, standing just off to the side of the podium, did not move. Her expression didn't change at all, which somehow made the moment worse. Then, from the section reserved for community residents, a man stood up. Timothy Ellison was 38 years old, a community attorney who had spent 6 years representing tenants on the South Side for less money than he could have made anywhere else downtown, because he'd grown up 2 blocks from Building 47 and had never once forgotten it. He lifted his phone in one hand and, without asking anyone's permission, read directly into the auxiliary microphone set up for public comment. "This is a text message Zawadi Harlan sent to a Cascade colleague 11 months ago," he said, his voice even controlled and utterly without mercy. "My husband's just a city worker. Don't bring him up around investors. It hurts my credibility." That message was sent the same night Quentin Harlan stayed up until sunrise, repairing an emergency power outage for an entire senior housing block, including his own mother's building. A ripple of sound moved through the hall, somewhere between a gasp and a groan. Zawadi stood at the podium, face gone completely white, both hands gripping the sides of the lectern as if it were the only thing holding her upright. There was nothing left to deny. The message had her name attached to it, her phone number, her own words, time-stamped and unmistakable. She looked toward Quentin. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said a single word since the reading began, but for the first time all evening, he lifted his head and looked directly back at her. Ashanti Cole stepped up to the podium herself, adjusting the microphone with the calm of a woman who had decided the moment had already gotten away from her, and there was nothing left to do but control the landing. "And so, everyone in this room fully understands the situation," Ashanti said, her voice flat, clinical, carrying easily to the back wall. If this project had been signed on its original timeline, Mrs. Zawadi Harlan was set to receive a model penthouse unit on floor 28, along with an observer seat on the Cascade Board of Directors. That arrangement exists in writing. A murmur rose and did not settle this time. Several investors exchanged glances, the kind of glance that in a boardroom usually means a deal has just quietly changed shape. One reporter's pen was already moving fast across her notepad, and a second reporter was already texting her editor that the 8 o'clock segment needed to be rewritten entirely. Ashanti had said it plainly, without apology, because in her experience the truth delivered flatly always did more damage than the truth delivered with any heat behind it. She had not planned to say it out loud tonight, but she had also learned over 30 years in rooms exactly like this one that once a room turns, the only thing left to control is how quickly you get ahead of it. Zawadi's eyes found Quentin again, and this time she couldn't look away. 11 years of marriage sat in that one look, every dinner, he'd quietly paid for out of overtime pay she never asked about. Every family gathering where she'd let his job title trail off into silence. Every small, unspoken humiliation she'd told herself he probably didn't even notice. He had noticed every single one. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above the microphone's threshold. But the room was so silent it carried anyway. "I was so afraid of being poor," she said, "that I was willing to become exactly the kind of person I used to despise." What broke Zawadi wasn't the cameras. It was the sudden, unbearable clarity that the woman she'd spent 11 years building had cost her the one person who loved her without conditions. Underneath the ambition sat an old, private fear. Memories of watching her own mother count coins at a checkout line, and a promise she'd made herself long ago, never to be that exposed again. She had mistaken being envied for being safe, and mistaken being loved. Plainly for being at risk, and standing at that podium with nothing left to perform for, she finally had to choose between the image and the truth. For the first time in years, she chose the truth. Nobody in the hall said anything for a long moment. Somewhere near the back, a single camera shutter kept clicking, almost apologetically, as if even the machines understood they were witnessing something that shouldn't be photographed, and yet couldn't look away from either. Alma Harlan, still standing just outside the double doors, pressed one hand flat against her chest and said nothing at all. She had raised her son to never once raise his voice to be heard. She hadn't expected to watch at 67 years old an entire ballroom finally understand why that mattered. Zawadi stepped back from the podium on unsteady legs. A staff member moved quickly to guide her toward a chair near the front row, though it wasn't clear anymore whose side of the room that chair belonged to. Every eye in that hall had shifted fully and unmistakably onto the man in the folding chair by the aisle. The same man who less than an hour earlier had been sent to wait outside like a stranger. Nobody in that room yet understood that Quentin Harlan hadn't come to that hotel empty-handed. He had been carrying something in his jacket pocket all night that was about to matter far more than a signature, something he had spent 4 quiet months building, long before his wife had ever asked him to sit outside like a stranger. A production assistant near the wings whispered into her headset, asking whether the ceremony should be paused. No one answered her right away. Ashanti Cole stood at the podium a moment longer, looking out at a room that no longer belonged entirely to her, and for the first time all evening, she looked briefly like a woman, waiting to see what happened next, rather than one deciding it. And in exactly 90 seconds, Quentin Harlan was going to stand up, walk to that same microphone, and show every person in that room exactly what 11 years of being underestimated can quietly build, one patient decision at a time. The hall was still holding its breath. Cameras kept rolling. Nobody had left. Nobody dared to whisper too loudly because everyone in that room could feel that whatever was happening wasn't finished yet. Somewhere near the middle rows, a waiter stood frozen with a tray of untouched champagne flutes, apparently having forgotten entirely what he'd been sent out to do. Zawadi's confession still hung in the air like smoke that hadn't quite cleared. A confession once spoken out loud in front of that many cameras doesn't simply end a moment. It opens a door. And every person in that hall, whether they realized it yet or not, was about to watch exactly what walked through it. Ashanti Cole stood at the podium watching Quentin with an expression that was equal parts challenge and underneath it something close to relief. The look of a woman who had spent 8 months carrying a decision alone and was not entirely sorry to see someone else finally stand up and share the weight of it. Quentin rose from his folding chair. He walked slowly toward the front of the hall, past rows of investors, past the aisle where his wife now sat with both hands pressed together in her lap. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead at Ashanti and past her at the room full of people who had decided an hour ago that he was somebody's driver. His work boots made a soft, steady sound against the marble. Nothing like the sharp click of heels the room had grown used to hearing all evening. A few of the investors shifted in their seats, unconsciously straightening their posture, the way people do around someone they've just realized they misjudged. He carried the same folder tucked under one arm that he'd carried up from the 3rd-floor conference room, along with a slim tablet he'd brought from home that morning, tucked into the bottom of his work bag, beside a thermos and a pair of extra gloves. He set a tablet down on the podium beside the microphone. "I'll license the technical infrastructure and grant the necessary utility easements," he said, his voice level unhurried, carrying easily to the back wall, without ever needing to rise. "On 3 conditions. Cascade converts this project from full clearance to in-place rehabilitation. A minimum of 30% equity goes into a community trust governed by residents. And Building 47 stays exactly where it stands." He let that sit a moment before he continued. "I've had this proposal ready for 4 months. Since the night I came home late and found the technical drawings for this exact project left out on my wife's desk and realized what I was looking at." Ashanti's face went carefully still, the particular stillness of someone doing quick math behind their eyes. A ripple of low conversation moved through the investor rows. One man near the front, silver-haired, clearly used to being the loudest voice in any room he entered, stood halfway up from his chair. "No serious investor puts capital into a project where residents hold 30%, he said, not quite shouting but close. Quentin turned the tablet slightly so the screen faced the room and tapped it once. A list appeared, names and figures clean and simple. 3 community trusts and a coalition of Bronzeville congregations are prepared to replace the full outside capital within 60 days if these conditions are met, he said. The largest single commitment on that list belongs to Amma Harlan, my mother. A sound moved through the hall that wasn't quite a gasp, but wasn't far from one either, the sound of a room recalculating all at once exactly who held the power in it. Quentin turned then, for the first time since he'd stood up, and looked at his wife. His voice dropped quieter now, but the microphone caught every word and carried it to the back row just the same. 11 years, he said. Every time you needed money to keep up appearances, handbags, flights for the reunion, another leadership course, another dress for another gala, that money came out of my personal savings. I picked up night shifts and weekend calls to cover it. You never once asked where it came from. I never once told you. Quentin had never kept that tally out of resentment. He'd kept none at all for years. Because saying it out loud always felt like turning love into a transaction. His deeper fear was never poverty. It was becoming a man who needed to be thanked to believe his sacrifices had mattered. All he'd ever wanted quietly was to be truly seen, not applauded, just noticed. He said it now in a room full of strangers instead of at his own kitchen table. Because this was the first place the truth could stand entirely on its own, without either of them having to decide what it meant for the marriage. Zawadi sat down slowly into the chair nearest the stage, though no one had told her to. Her hands were shaking now openly, and tears slid down her face without her bothering to wipe them away. It was, for the first time all night, an entirely honest expression on her face. She thought of the leadership course in Scottsdale, $1,100, paid for in cash he'd handed her without a single question. She thought of the reunion in Atlanta 2 summers back, the new dress for it, the flight, the hotel, small things, each one small enough on its own to never notice. The way a slow leak in a roof never announces itself until the ceiling finally gives way. She had spent 11 years building an image for rooms exactly like this one, and she was only now understanding whose shoulders that image had actually been standing on the whole time. Timothy Ellison stood again, adding one more line into the auxiliary microphone, and the hall stirred all over again at the sound of it. According to records our office has reviewed, he said, Mr. Harlan has turned down at least 2 high-paying offers over the past 6 years, specifically to keep his infrastructure oversight seat here in Bronzeville. Somewhere in the 3rd row, an older man in a church suit murmured just loud enough for the people around him to hear, Lord have mercy. A woman beside him nodded slowly, both hands pressed to her chest. Amma, still standing just outside the prop door, closed her eyes for a moment. She had known some of it, not all of it, certainly not the part about the reunion flights or the leadership courses or how many double shifts her son had quietly stacked on top of each other, year after year, so that nobody else in that marriage would ever have to feel the difference. She thought of all the Sunday dinners where Quentin had shown up tired but never once complaining. All the times she'd asked if everything was all right at home, and he'd simply said, "We're fine, Mama," and changed the subject to something easier. She had raised him to carry things quietly. Standing outside that hall now, she wondered, not for the first time that year, whether she'd taught her son to be strong or simply taught him never to ask for help. Ashanti stepped back from the podium slightly, arms folded, watching the room shift beneath her like ground she could no longer be entirely certain was solid. She had built her whole career believing that leverage was the only real language spoken in rooms like this one. She was beginning slowly to suspect she'd just watched a different kind of leverage altogether. Patience, and 11 years of it finally get spent all at once. An investor near the back stood up and began quietly gathering her things, phone already pressed to her ear. Another leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something about optics and the morning news cycle. A third simply sat very still, watching Quentin the way a person watches a hand of cards they suddenly realize they've badly underestimated. The room, which an hour earlier had felt so certain of itself, now had the loose, unsettled energy of a courtroom waiting on a verdict nobody could quite predict. Quentin didn't raise his voice once through any of it. He didn't need to. There is a particular kind of quiet that lands harder in a room than shouting ever could, and everyone present that night was learning exactly how heavy it could be. He looked back at the tablet, then at Ashanti. "You have 60 days," he said, "or the offer expires and Building 47 stays exactly as it is, regardless, because the easements you need run directly through land my mother's trust already holds." Ashanti didn't answer right away. For a woman who had spent 30 years never once being caught without a response ready, the silence stretched long enough that even the reporters noticed it. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a phone camera held low and discreet by someone in the community section kept recording every second of it, footage that by morning several million people would have already watched at least twice. Zawadi looked up at her husband from the chair where she sat, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't looking at him to see how he made her look to the room. She was simply looking at him. Nobody in that hall yet knew that the hardest decision of the entire night hadn't happened yet. That it wouldn't come from Ashanti Cole, or from the investors, or even from Zawadi. It was still 3 days away, sitting quietly on a conference table, waiting for Quentin Harlan to decide exactly how much of his own power he was actually willing to walk away from, and whether the answer to that question would cost more than any of them, including him, were prepared to pay. 3 days later, a private conference room sat on the 22nd floor of the Cascade Urban Group building on Wacker Drive, overlooking the gray-green bend of the Chicago River. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon light. Ashanti Cole had asked Quentin to come alone. He didn't come alone. Zawadi asked to be there too, and for reasons neither of them fully said out loud, he let her. She had barely spoken to him since the hotel, not out of coldness, but out of something closer to shame, the particular kind that doesn't know yet what words might be allowed to follow it. She sat now in a chair slightly apart from the table, close enough to be present, careful enough not to presume she belonged in the center of it. A single sheet of paper sat on the polished table when they walked in, an ultimatum from the Cascade Board of Directors typed in careful, bloodless corporate language that somehow made the threat inside it feel worse, not better. Ashanti slid it across the table toward Quentin without ceremony. The terms were simple. If he did not sign the original clearance agreement within 72 hours, the major investors would withdraw their capital entirely. Cascade would collapse. 1,800 employees would lose their jobs, many of them residents of Bronzeville and the surrounding neighborhoods, people who had nothing to do with any of this and everything to lose from it. "You won the moral argument, Mr. Harlan," Ashanti said, and for the first time since the night at the hotel, she sounded tired rather than composed. She had spent 3 sleepless nights fielding calls from board members who wanted the entire matter buried before the next quarterly report, and 2 of them, unofficially, had already suggested it might be simpler if she resigned before it came to that. But if this company folds, thousands of families lose their income. Are you certain that's a price you're willing to make them pay? Quentin didn't answer right away. He read the page twice, the way he read anything that mattered, and then set it down flat on the table. He turned his chair slightly toward the window and looked out past the river, past the skyline, toward the direction where Bronzeville sat quiet and patient, the way it had sat through every decade of the city's promises and broken promises alike. Zawadi had been sitting in the corner of the room, technically present only as a related party, a phrase in the meeting invite that had stung more than she expected. For 3 days she had barely slept. She had watched the video of the press conference online along with several million strangers and had read every comment beneath it twice. The cruel ones and the kind ones both. Because some part of her felt she owed it to herself not to look away. One comment from a stranger she would never meet had stayed with her longer than the rest. She finally found out the hard way that respect isn't something you buy a seat closer to. It's something you earn by standing next to the people who don't have one. She had read it so many times she could recite it in her sleep, if sleep had been coming to her at all. She spoke now for the first time since they'd sat down. "Sign it," she said quietly. "Then we negotiate with the residents quietly afterward, once the company's stable. You've already won, Quentin. Don't lose everything else trying to win completely." It was, in its own way, the most honest thing she had said to him in 11 years. An admission that she still, even now, believed some compromises were simply the cost of staying safe. Quentin turned his chair back around and looked at his wife. There was no anger left in his eyes by that point. There hadn't been really since the night at the hotel. What was there instead was something steadier, and in some ways harder to sit across from. A kind of clarity that comes only after a person has finally stopped needing anyone else's approval to know what's true. "A wrong thing doesn't become right," he said, "just because the person doing it happens to be in trouble." The threat of 1,800 jobs pressed against something old in Quentin, the same reflex that once made him quietly cover a neighbor's rent rather than watch them get put out on the street. His fear was never the company's collapse. It was becoming even once the kind of man who let a wrong stand because refusing it cost too much. What he wanted more than a win was to still recognize himself when this was over. So when Zawadi urged him to sign now and fix it quietly later, the real conflict wasn't between him and her. It was between the man who had spent a lifetime bending to keep the peace and the one decision he finally couldn't afford to bend on. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Ashanti's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Zawadi looked down at her hands. Quentin stood, buttoned his jacket, the same navy work jacket still faintly marked with drywall dust from 3 days earlier because he hadn't had the time or the inclination to think about wardrobe, and walked toward the door. "I'll have an answer for the board by Friday," he said, not unkindly, just plainly the way he said most things. "It won't be the one on that page." He left the room without signing anything. The hallway outside was long and quiet, all glass and soft gray carpet, the kind of hallway built to make a person feel small on their walk out. Quentin didn't feel small in it. He felt, if anything, like a man finally walking at his own pace after 11 years of matching someone else's. That evening he drove south on Lakeshore Drive, past the skyline lighting up gold against the darkening water, until the road became King Drive, the street his mother still called South Parkway, out of old habit, and pulled up outside Building 47. Amma was waiting for him on the front steps, a cardigan pulled tight against the evening chill, 2 mugs of coffee already poured, one black, one with cream, exactly the way she'd made them since he was 19 years old. "You look tired, baby," she said, handing in the black one. "I am tired, Mama." They sat together on the concrete steps for a long while without speaking, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one down the block. The same lights he'd helped modernize 15 years earlier, back when nobody downtown had known his name and hadn't needed to. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's radio played gospel music, low through an open window, and 2 boys rode bicycles in slow, looping circles under the last of the daylight, the way boys had probably done on that same stretch of sidewalk for 50 years running. "Whatever you decide, Friday," Amma said finally, "you decide it because it's right, not because it's easy and not because it's safe. I didn't raise you to choose easy." Quentin looked out at the building behind them, The brick a little worn, the window units a little old, but every light in every window still on. Every family inside, still exactly where they belonged. "I know what I'm going to do, Mama," he said. "I've known since the day I first saw those drawings on Zawadi's desk. I just needed 3 days to be sure I wasn't doing it out of anger." "And are you sure now?" He looked at his mother, then back at the building, then finally down at his own hands, the same broad, calloused hands that had spent 20 years keeping the lights on for people nobody downtown ever thought to thank. "I'm sure," he said. 2 days later, word went out that Quentin Harlan had requested one final press conference to be held back at the Four Seasons Hotel, in the very same hall where everything had first come apart 3 days before. Nobody, not Ashanti Cole, not the board, not even Zawadi, knew exactly what he was going to say. Reporters who had covered the first press conference cleared their schedules without being asked twice. Residents from Bronzeville arranged carpools and bus fare among themselves, determined that whatever happened in that hall this time, they would not be left standing outside the door again. But every single person who had been in that hall 3 nights earlier made absolutely certain they were in the room again. Because whatever Quentin Harlan had decided, sitting quiet on those concrete steps beside his mother, was about to change the shape of everything that came after it. The next morning, the same grand hall at the Four Seasons filled again. Reporters, residents, board members, cameras lined 3 deep along the back wall. This time, folding chairs had been added at the front for community members, and nobody had to ask twice to be let in. Ashanti Cole took her seat in the front row, rather than on stage. Zawadi sat several rows back beside Amma, who had, without a word, reached over and taken her hand. Outside, the March rain from 3 nights earlier had finally cleared, and thin morning light came through the tall glass doors, instead falling across the same marble floor where a wooden bench had once sat empty by the service entrance. Someone from hotel staff had quietly moved that bench inside overnight, off to the side near the coat check, though nobody had asked them to, and nobody would remove it again. Everyone in that hall was waiting to see whether Quentin Harlan would sign or refuse. He walked to the podium without a folder, without a tablet, without a single page of notes. "I won't be signing the original agreement," he said, his voice calm, unhurried, carrying to every corner of the room the way it always had, without ever needing to rise. "And I also won't be keeping the legacy signing authority that's brought us all back into this room a second time." A murmur moved through the crowd, quick and uncertain. "Effective right now, I'm transferring all technical approval rights over the historic Bronzeville infrastructure system to the Bronzeville Community Trust. Permanently. Irrevocably. From this moment forward, no single person, including me, can ever again be forced to sign away this neighborhood's future." The hall broke into low, disbelieving conversation. Ashanti rose halfway from her seat, her face gone pale in a way it hadn't managed even 3 nights earlier. Zawadi stared at her husband as if seeing for the first time someone she had genuinely never fully known. Giving away the one thing that had finally made a room stop mistaking him for someone's driver was, in its own way, harder than staying quiet for 11 years had ever been. His fear wasn't losing influence, it was slowly becoming a man who needed that influence to know his own worth, the same trap he'd just watched swallow his marriage. What he wanted was simpler and rarer than power. To matter without being feared, to be safe without needing to be obeyed. Handing the signature to the community wasn't surrender. It was the first time what he did on the outside finally matched who he'd always quietly been on the inside. "The power that got everyone in this room to say my name 3 nights ago," Quentin continued, "I'm handing back to the people it was always supposed to belong to. Because real standing was never about the chair nearest to power. It's about who you're willing to stand next to when nobody's watching anymore." Silence held for several seconds. The kind of silence a room only sits in when it understands it has just watched something rare. Ashanti approached the podium then, and gestured toward the front row, toward the seat reserved for him at the head of the honored guests. Quentin shook his head. Instead, he walked down past the front row entirely and pulled a folding chair over into the 3rd row, where the residents' representatives sat, where his mother sat. He sat down beside her. The entire hall rose to its feet, not for a CEO, Not for an investor. For a third-row chair that had never once had a name card on it. Zawadi stood for a long moment where she was watching him. Then she stepped down, crossed the aisle, and pulled an empty folding chair over beside her husband and sat down without asking permission. Because for the first time in 11 years, there was no seat being saved for anyone else, and none being denied to her either. Quentin said one more thing, quiet enough that the room had to lean in to catch it, and clear enough that every camera caught it anyway. "The most important seat in the room was never the one closest to the CEO," he said. "It's the one nobody's ever forced to give up." The cameras panned slowly across the hall from the empty, gleaming honor seats at the front, still catching the light to the crowded, ordinary folding chairs in the third row where Quentin sat beside his mother, with Timothy Ellison and a dozen Bronzeville residents around them. And his wife, quiet and changed, sitting close beside him. In the weeks that followed, Building 47 stayed exactly where it stood. Its window units a little old, its brick a little worn. Every family inside still exactly where they belonged. The rehabilitation work began that spring, funded in part by the very community trust that now held the signature Quentin had once carried alone. New handrails went up along the front steps. The elevator that had sat broken for 4 months finally got repaired within the week, and nobody had to ask twice this time either. Amma kept her apartment, her Sunday cardigan, and her spot on the front steps, though. She started keeping 2 mugs out most evenings instead of 1, because her son had started coming by more often than he used to. Ashanti Cole kept her position at Cascade, though the board's tone toward her changed in ways she never fully explained to anyone. She sent Quentin a short note some weeks later, only a few lines, thanking him for handling what she called the hardest deal of my career, with more grace than she believed she'd earned. Zawadi didn't get her penthouse on floor 28. She didn't get her board seat either. What she got instead slowly, over months that were harder than any single night at any hotel had been, was the chance to sit in a marriage without a performance attached to it, to learn a little late, but not too late, what her husband's actual life had cost him, and to finally ask the questions she'd spent 11 years too afraid to ask. Some nights they sat together on those same concrete steps outside Building 47, coffee in hand, watching the same streetlights come on, one by one, down the block. This story reminds us that respect was never something Zawadi could buy with a penthouse view, and it was never something Quentin needed a title to prove. It lived in something smaller and harder to fake, the willingness to sit down next to people a room has already decided don't matter. If you've spent decades in a marriage, you already know loyalty rarely announces itself. It shows up as an extra shift nobody sees, a bill paid quietly before anyone thinks to ask, a decision made alone at midnight, so somebody else can keep sleeping. Quentin never once demanded credit for any of it. That wasn't weakness. That was a man protecting the people he loved from feeling the full weight of what love actually costs. Here's something practical, neighbor to neighbor, not a speech. If you're widowed, or the kids have scattered 3 states away, or the house feels quieter than it used to, don't wait for someone else to notice your worth before you go find your own third row. Call the friend you've been meaning to call this week, not someday. Show up to the church potluck alone, if that's the only way you'll show up at all. Most rooms fill in fast once you're actually standing in them. Write down one thing you did for your family that nobody ever thanked you for, and let yourself be proud of it anyway, with no audience required. And if there's still someone across the breakfast table from you, ask one real question tonight you've never asked before. Not about dinner, not the weather. Ask what they quietly gave up for you over the years and sit still for the answer. Quentin didn't get his dignity back from a press conference. He never lost it in the first place. He simply stopped waiting for someone else to see it first. That's what you get to carry home tonight. Not the applause, but the choosing. This story was written by a human, accompanied by AI. It exists to remind us that even when wrongly judged or treated unfairly, kindness and resilience can still change everything, because life and family always reserve their rightful rewards for those who never lose their dignity. Production team story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.